I don't want to steal much time from the protagonist of this event. I just want to thank you for being here today. My name is Zeno Leoni. I'm a lecturer in Defense Studies at the Defense Studies Department of King's College London. And I'm also an affiliate to the Lau China Institute, which is organizing this event. I just wanted to give you some context about the event before handing it over to the panel. We are presenting one of actually the latest paper in a series of policy papers, which is called China in the World, which the Lau China Institute launched about a couple of years ago. You find so far about 10 papers on the website of the series. Most of them come from members of the Lau China Institute, but one of the main objectives of this series was and is to have a sort of cross King's College London approach, and so trying to leverage those synergies of China's expertise that we find, China's expertise that we find not only in the Lau, of course, but also in our department, Defense Studies Department, War Studies, and in many other departments of King's College London, especially of the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy, and sometimes, in some occasions, as it happened in the past and also today, leveraging connections from even outside King's and even outside the United Kingdom. So that was the very first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is about China and the Gulf. I think it is very important that we're doing an event on this topic. This is an extremely important relationship. I have some experience. I work on US-China relations, so I know a bit about the United States, I think, and I know that the Gulf has been absolutely pivotal in the US hegemony for many decades. I don't know if it will be the same for China, but I think this is going to be an extremely important relationship. So I just wanted to say that I think, at the very least, as from a King's College London perspective, I hope we will be able to look more and more into this relationship in the future, and I hope that this event is just the start of a sort of more formal, more consistent effort towards in that direction. And this is a discussion that informally we have already had. So hopefully today's is the very first step in that regard. That's all from me. I guess I'll hand it to the moderator, Ahmed Aboudouh. Okay.
Yeah, hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Zeno. It's a pleasure to be here. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ahmed Aboudouh. I'm a senior fellow with APC and a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Let me first say that I'm very delighted to return back to the Strand, where I spend a lot of my time doing my MA in IR in War Studies Department, where I learned a lot from world-class and excellent lecturers here. I would also like to thank our host, the Lau China Institute, for convening this panel, but also for producing a lot of research, cutting-edge research on China's foreign policy, internal politics, economic policies, but also climate policies. I must first outline this panel, the structure of this panel. So this panel will kick off with a discussion among our panelists and esteemed speakers. And then in the end, there will be a space for audience participation. You'll be able to ask any question you have, but please, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and say the name of the speaker you want to address your question to. I don't need to remind you to keep your question, please, as concise as possible. So today we are going to discuss a paper titled Culture, History, and Change, the Gulf in Between the West and China, authored by Dr. David Roberts and Dr. Chuchu Zhang. This is one of a series, as Zeno said, that China Lau Institute published already on their website, They examine China's diplomatic and economic and trade and security relations with a number of their security partners in different parts of the world, but also very important other themes, such as China's space program and China's Silk Road project in Europe. So do go to the website, read them. They will enhance your already deep knowledge on China. So today, this paper we are going to discuss consists of two main parts. The first one gives a very essential background of and analyzes very well the relationship between the Gulf and their Western partners. The second one delves deeper into China's rising power and influence in the Gulf. And I think in addition to grasping very well the dynamics of China's rising influence in the Gulf, I think this paper is very, very timely because it comes out as China-Gulf relations are taking historic turn. You know, China and the Gulf know each other for decades, and big part of that is because China's rapid economic development throughout the 80s, 90s, and beyond created an insatiable need for oil in China. This was complemented and enhanced later by Xi's rise to power and the launching of the BRI in 2013. Since then, the question that has actually dominated the thinking and discussions in the Gulf, but also in Western capitals like Washington and London, and even European capitals, was about has been about the potential of these economic underpinnings of the relationship between China and the Gulf to expand a little more into more policy, strategy, and security related domains. Xi's visit to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia last December, as you all know, to attend the first summit between China and the Gulf, fueled speculations that the time for China to play a more strategic role in the Gulf has finally arrived. And it was no time, as also you all know, before China announced in last March that it facilitated rather than mediated a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran to de-escalate tensions and resume diplomatic relations. To discuss that and many other very important stuff, we are joined today by a very esteemed and distinguished panel. I will start by introducing Dr. David Roberts, who is a co-author of the paper we are discussing today. Dr. Roberts is an associate professor at King's College London. He's also adjunct faculty at Sciences Po. Previously, Dr. Roberts was the director of the Gulf Office of the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies, think tank RUSI in Qatar. His primary research interest focuses on the politics, foreign policy, and international security of the Gulf monarchies and the wider Middle East. His new book, just hot off the presser, and I really encourage you to read it, Security Politics in the Gulf Monarchies, was published this year in 2023 by Columbia University Press. Also joining us from China, Dr. Chuchu Zhang, the co-author of the paper and associate professor of international relations in the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University in China. She's also deputy director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. She received her PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. Her research focuses on the Middle Eastern politics, Sino-Middle Eastern relations, and regional governance. She's author of Islamist Party Mobilization, Tunisia and Nahda, and Algeria's HMS compared between 1989 and 2014. And last but not least, of course, Dr. Don Murphy, joining us from the US, is Associate Professor of National Security Strategy at the US National War College, where she specializes in Chinese foreign policy and domestic politics, US-China relations, and international relations. Her research analyzes China's interests and behavior as a rising global power towards the existing international order, just like Zeno. Dr. Murphy examines China's relations with the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa in her book, China's Rise in the Global South, the Middle East, Africa, and Beijing's Alternative World Order. So welcome today. I will start with Dr. Roberts, and I will let you set the scene for us, but I would also like to ask you a question that I cannot ignore because the paper was very good at addressing this. It eloquently addressed the issue of mistrust currently dominating Gulf perceptions. It says, and I quote, "The fundamental elastic on the logic of US engagement in the monarchies is breaking down. That tax on Saudi Arabia's most important oil refinery at Abqaiq in 2019 showed that US deterrence did not deter and US protection did not protect. This moment constituted the revelation that the US emperor had no clothes." That was a very good line. So please set the scene for us in the context of the Gulf states' perceptions of its traditional Western partners and in the context of China's increasing involvement in the Gulf, please.
Okie dokie. So thanks so much. Assalamu alaikum and ni hao, of course. It's a pleasure to be here. These events are never easy to put together, so I'm very grateful for everybody's time and engagement. It's always worrying to have someone quote your own words to you before they ask a question, but I'll come back to that, and if I don't, just come back to me, because I've got a terrible memory. I want to say two things to sort of outline our discussion in many ways, and one is this basically implicit part of these debates that we have with China or the Gulf or wherever it is. It's very rarely fleshed out, and it's the concept of engagement. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And I think one of the difficult things about this is that there are principled arguments on both sides. If you are a British person, an American person who thinks we absolutely don't want to engage, we disagree with political decisions, societal decisions, whatever it may be, you think that, yeah, we ought not to engage. Well, I don't agree with that, but that is a principled, coherent stance, I think. My point, and I very oddly find myself in agreement with a Conservative minister on this, the Foreign Secretary spoke about British-China relations just a couple of weeks ago, and I agreed with it a lot. It's an absolute revelation these days. And his line was that, you know, simplifying and ignoring China from any perspective, including the British perspective, is impossible, impractical, and unwise. And I absolutely agree with that. I think that engagement is the only way to go if you want to try to exert some influence and change things. Now, is changing things easy? By absolutely no stretch of any imagination. But if you are an anti-engagement person, perfectly legit, a coherent position, but what is your strategy for changing? And there are discussions to be had here. I'm presenting it in a simplistic way, perhaps. But I think that's the implicit underpinnings of these sorts of debates. The second thing I wanted to say before I get to Ahmed's question. So I'm an academic, we're in an academic setting. Let me use a convoluted phrase which sounds difficult and maybe not helpful, but I promise is a little helpful. So Foucault, honestly, I'm going to talk about Foucault, but just briefly, I promise. He had this thing called the dispositif. It's like a big paradigm. So there's a dispositif in education, in international affairs, in health, whatever it may be. And the reason I like this idea of the dispositif is that it says in any given sphere, milieu, whatever it is, and we are talking about sort of Chinese engagement in the Gulf, Western engagement in the Gulf. So in this sphere, there are surface issues. There is trade, there are laws, there are institutions, there are the visible things. But the dispositif says what is equally important, or what are equally important, are the subsurface elements that underpin everything that's transpired, the said and the unsaid, as our French friend might put it. So it is to do with the long-term architectures that have been created, and make that a literal architecture, if you will, or a more metaphorical one. It's to do with the relationships that have been formed. It's to do with those really intangible issues of where do leaders like to go, perceptions, how are relationships between significant individuals, whether leaders or leaders of corporations or students. You know, these things all matter. They are subsurface. We will definitely talk about energy dynamics, security dynamics, visible manifestations of those things. They are very important to our chat. But the subsurface stuff, which is less visible, I find to be quite important too. And I think we might come back to that in a variety of little ways in the next, how long we've got here. When we are speaking to the enduring nature of quote unquote Western Gulf relationships. Now, sort of moving on to your question a little bit. So I do think that the broad elastic of the US Gulf relationship is deeply troubled, snapped a little bit. Just to sort of set the scene very briefly, of course, we have grown up in a world where in the past 30 years, the American military empire is a loaded term. I don't mean it in a particular negative way, but you know, the manifestations of US imperial power, I say it again, don't I, have been so present in the Gulf. You know, one of the largest, most important US military bases outside of continental America is in Al Udeid. It's a kilometer from the Emir's palace where he sleeps at night, you know. And from Al Udeid is CENTCOM, where America directs an entire segment of the world's central command, which stretches from the coast of the Horn of Africa up to Afghanistan. So these are not just military bases. They are pivotal nodes in the US grand order, whatever the phrase may be. So our friends in the Gulf have experienced this reality for the past 30 odd years, and going back another 50 or 60 years, 70 years in some cases, our friends in the leadership positions in the Gulf have been buying in to the US, do you want to call it a world order, to the US political industrial complex, whatever the phrase may be, again, not in a nefarious way, but they've been investing very heavily. And leaders in the Gulf, I don't know whether they read the terms and services, you know, the terms and conditions of all agreements. I don't think they do. But I think the norms, the belief grew up that America was an ally and it would defend them. When friends in the Gulf said to America, you know, our allies in America, any and all Americans cognizant of this would say, no, we're not allies. We are good friends and maybe partners. Words are really important. An ally is a very different thing to a partner. There are no NATO Article 5 type agreements between America and anybody in the Gulf. And I think this de facto reality was misunderstood. The relationship became, speaking in the military sphere, so kind of close between America and the Gulf allies that there was just an implicit assumption that, well, I mean, come on, there is so much American military equipment in the region. We have been investing. It's really difficult for us to invest politically, domestically, regionally in and with the US, or has been. And we've invested hundreds of billions of dollars. Like, of course, there is more here. There is basically an alliance here, was, I think, the approach from our friends in the Gulf. And absolutely not. And despite however many times Americans might slightly disabuse them of this notion, it needed the 14th or the 19th of September 14th of September 2019, which is when there was an attack on the world's most important, the world's largest oil refining facility. It's in Abqaiq in Saudi Arabia. There was also an attack on Khurais as well. And this was de facto Iranian cruise missiles and drones. They whistled through expensively assembled missile defenses and struck with pinpoint accuracy key nodes in the oil refining facility. And the point from our friends in the Gulf is, what on earth has the point been of enduring all of the 70 years of troublesome relations with our American friends, investing hundreds of billions of dollars? Why have we done this, if not to prevent exactly that kind of an attack on exactly that piece of critical national infrastructure? So that I see Abqaiq as a fundamental inflection point in the contemporary history of the Gulf, where our friends in Gulf leadership positions really realize that Uncle Sam is not omnipotent. Uncle Sam will not necessarily defend us. And what did President Trump do in the aftermath of Abqaiq? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing of any import whatsoever. So this is why I see that as fraying relationships. We can go into it more, but in the interest of time, I don't want to too much. Increasingly tricky relationship. I see the Abqaiq moment as of profound importance. And the context, why this is relevant to our chat today, is that this...
I'm sorry, can I stop you there? Because actually, I want to expand on this point. And I had another question for you to push you to expand on this, because I know you are so good at it. So it is, you're saying, in effect, that this is a security for oil arrangement. It's not an alliance, and both sides have to understand this. But if it lacks strategic substance, let's think about it differently. Now, if the Gulf think that they have an alliance, and this is an illusion, of course, with the US, why the US then, if they understand the relationship for what it is, why then they adopt a coercive approach towards Gulf states' security and technological cooperation with China, if they do not have alliance and if they do not have legitimacy to do that?
So I'll defer a bit to some of the super guests that we have on the line. Be interested to get their thoughts, and it's useful to get a corrective if I'm going off base. But I think that America has long looked at the Gulf as its own backyard. They know there is not an alliance, but they want their cake, they have their cake and they want to eat it. So of course there's not an alliance, but at the same time, you'll do as you're told. There's been this paternalistic, or if you like the language, hegemonic kind of an attitude from our friends in Washington towards the Gulf, a deep irritation for an extraordinarily long time, but the feeling that we have, let's go back, America was pivotally important in liberating Kuwait, of course, in 1990, well, 1991, more precisely. So America has played that liberating role in the past, that literally liberating role. And so I just think it's the dynamics of the relationship and the broad sentiment of what is, I'll defer to Zeno or whomever here, what is the broad tenor of US-China relations at the moment? Is it seen as a zero-sum game? Reasonably, quite a lot of the time, I think. And so I think there's this fear of incremental gains in the Gulf at America's expense or something along those lines. But the last thing I'll say about this is that while the elastic might have been broken or frayed or whatever tortured analogy I used, the dispositif stuff is really important. The subsurface reality that there are dozens and hundreds of individual military contracts for training, logistics, supplies, even out with the military realm. America has been so influential in the economic growth of the Gulf monarchies for so long that those basic institutions, I use the word institutions to mean, whether we mean that in terms of State Department or companies themselves or operating procedures. This is the use of the Foucault stuff. It's about the norms, the expectations, the architectures, the supply lines, the stuff you don't necessarily think about. You can't just pivot and buy whatever the Chinese equivalent of an F-18 is. Well, you kind of can, but it's just going to sit there because they are not plug and play items. They are deeply convoluted, exquisite pieces of technology that mandate, you might be able to drive a tank around the desert, but you can't just hop in a plane and fly it around. It takes years and years and years of pilot training, all these sorts of things. I'm speaking about very hard security issues like here, but I think that's reflected across the piece. And so again, my last point, I've already said that, but I promise my last point is just this idea that we need to try to keep in mind the unsaid things, the norms and the expectations and the relationships that have been formed that augur, that suggest, that help, whatever the phrase may be, the continuance of Western Gulf relations against a really tricky backdrop. And that's sort of something that China, as it were, has to overcome in some ways.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you so much for answering. No, but can we do that in the end, please? Thank you. Just in the interest, save some time. Let me bring Chuchu in. Can you hear me, Chuchu?
Oh, yes, I can hear you well.
Yeah, welcome to the panel. I'll just go straight forward with you on this question and give you the time to answer it. Someone recently wrote that in the Washington Post, I guess, that you could draw a straight line from the 2019 attack on Abqiq and Kharis to Saudi's normalization for relations with Iran in 2023. Based on that assumption, the Gulf states clearly no longer consider the US as a reliable partner. And they seem more determined to push back against US pressure regarding their deepening ties with China in security and advanced technology, of course, as we said before. How is China exploiting this gap that is widening every day, as David eloquently said, in the US Gulf mutual perceptions? You have the mic.
Oh. Okay, thank you so much, Ahmed, and thank you so much, Zaino. It has been a great pleasure to work with David, to work with Lau China Institute. As David has pointed out, so our article basically it adopts a comparative perspective to analyze the different approaches adopted by China and Western countries in the Gulf region. So basically compared to the UK and the US, China is a latecomer in the region, but today, as Ahmed has just mentioned, China seems to be playing an increasingly important role in the Gulf. So I have met Professor Yahya Zubir in Shanghai, and he read our paper and he basically agreed our agreement. He thinks that China has, drawn lessons from the past when it did not engage much in the region, but after the Arab awakening, happened, China suffered huge losses in the Arab region in general, as so many regimes either collapsed or, went into civil wars. So Beijing learned that it had to engage in some way. But Yahya says that he thinks China's approach is kind of like discrete engagement, while I would argue that it's kind of like engagement without interference. We can discuss about it. But the questions I think people are interested in are, first, how does China frame its presence in the region? And second, what does China's presence really mean to both the region and the world? Well, first of all, I think China knows very well that it is a latecomer. And although it is kind of like the second economic power in the world, it knows that its capacity of investing resources everywhere is incomparable to not only the United States, but also France, the United Kingdom, all the established powers in the region. And also its soft power remains weak compared to those big powers. So China knows that it should act as a different power, and it should distinguish itself from the established powers, not only in the Middle East, but in the developing world. So now the question comes, so how it can make itself different? I think that I totally agree with what David has just mentioned. It's not just the visible things are important. Well, of course, infrastructure, everything, but the implicit thing is also important. And I think today China is trying to create two impressions. First of all, it is very close to the Middle East. So we are like the Middle East. We have, like both the Middle Eastern countries and us have ancient cultures, like we are both Oriental civilizations. So the Middle East is called Middle East, but actually China is like the Far East. And also like both civilizations used to be kind of like colonies or like semi-colonies, like we have the same destiny. And the second thing, it wants to distinguish itself from the West is that we are a newcomer, so we are different from the established powers. So for instance, China emphasizes that it is different. It insists on the non-interference policy in the region. And also it says that it offers an alternative for the region to choose from. So, and also it keeps saying that let's do business together, but each of us just minds its own business. We don't, interfere with each other. So it is important but I think still we should bear in mind that China's role in the region is remarkable today, but also limited in some way. So for instance, as you mentioned about the reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, we have seen a lot of media coverage about that. But I think it's not that China promoted everything from the beginning to the end. While yes, China played a role, but both Iran and Saudi Arabia had the intention first to restore their ties, and they approached each other for quite a while. And in the end, China became the place where both sides decide to declare their reconciliation. Why is China? It's because China is a big power, and because neither Russia nor the United States would be in the right place, because as we know, the United States somehow supports Saudi and Russia supports Iran. So in the end, it's China. So even though the reconciliation was declared in China, and China made great effort in mediating the two sides, but if you want to replicate this reconciliation model in other disputes in the region or in other regions, it's still difficult. And also, we should not exaggerate China's intention and capacity to expand its influence, to invest in resources in the region. And return to your question, which is my last point. You have mentioned about how China might, exploit the gap between the United States and the Gulf. I would say that we can also, turn the question a little bit, or maybe we can approach the question from another perspective. So we can say that instead of China exploits the pressure between the United States and Gulf, maybe we could rather say that the Gulf states, such as Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, are in a very advantageous position today, as there is the United States and China tensions. So these kind of tensions between big powers give them a space to hedge between the two powers. So today, Saudi can just come to the United States and says, okay, if you don't give me this kind of weapons or technology, I will turn to China. You may want to ask, so what benefits can China gain in this kind of situation? Personally, I think,
Chuchu,
yeah,
to ask now, because
yeah,
you just raised a couple of very interesting points. But let me first apologize it's my fault for not mentioning that Dr. Yahya Zubair could not join us today for another important commitment. But thank you, Chuchu, for laying out his arguments and point. So you're saying, going back to the mediation effort between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because I'm really interested in this, you're saying basically that China didn't do much. China saw a low-risk diplomatic opportunity, and it jumped on it. And you're saying that Saudi and Iran were willing to give China a diplomatic win versus the US. So my next question was, what is the objective of China from jumping on this opportunity, if I might say that?
Oh, so first of all, I need to clarify that I didn't say that China did played little role in this reconciliation, but not just as much as we exaggerate in the media coverage. It's like China is now threatening the United States, blah blah blah. It's not like that. But actually, what China did was basically like China always, try to mediate the kind of disputes between the two sides, and China says, okay, we can provide a platform, to invite both sides to discuss, and why not we develop together, since both sides wants to either develop its economy like Iran, or they diversify its economic structure like Saudi. So we have the same kind of goal, so why don't we work together? It's like that. But so this kind of scenario is different from the other disputes, as I mentioned, because both sides actually they have the kind of intention, and they are working on that direction, and they chose China just because at this point China is the right place or a good place for them to declare that issue and to make it happen. But it doesn't mean that it can become a model that we can use it in a lot of disputes. It might be different. And as you mentioned, so what can China gain from this kind of presence. Well, I would say that the most important thing that China wants is to be part of this kind of bargaining table. That is important for us because, today China is saying that it's become an important power in the world. So it want a kind of influence. But in the past, in the Middle East, for instance, it is a very important region in the world and we need the energy. But the thing is, whenever something happens, because you always say that, okay, we, hands off, we adopt a hands-off approach in the region, we don't want to get deeply involved. Then whenever there is an issue, there's a problem, there is a negotiation, China is not on the table, nobody cares about what China thinks, right? But today, China becomes a power. It hopes that at least it can become part of the bargaining table. So today, when Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or Iran, they hedge between big powers, for China, it's kind of like an opportunity since it can, be brought to this bargaining power. Its voice is heard, and that is at this stage, that is what it wants.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was very good, although I might slightly disagree and say that the Omanis and Qatar and Iraqis did the heavy lifting in terms of mediating between Iranians and the Saudis, and China just still insists, in my opinion, that saw an opportunity and just went for it. But I would like to go to the US, bring Dawn in the conversation and ask her basically the same question to see the US perspective on that, how the US and its Western allies see China's mediation of Saudi-Iran deal, and this offer, whether we consider it realistic or not, that's another discussion, to play a role between the Palestinians and Israelis recently. Dawn.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I prepared a few remarks and they fit nicely with the question more broadly, right? And so two things I wanted to highlight. One was that China's role in these various ways in the region are not new, although obviously compared to some other regions like Sub-Saharan Africa new. So I want to say a few words about that. Also, they're increasingly institutionalized, but I'll get back to your question as I go through this. So one thing to highlight, it was mentioned earlier as far as the meeting with Xi Jinping going to Saudi in December. And I think that we need to look at this in comparative perspective, that the China Arab States Cooperation Forum has been meeting since 2004. It meets every 2 years. And although this was the first summit level, so the first time it was held at the presidential level, it's something that's been an ongoing institutionalized part of relations more broadly, covering obviously the entire Arab world. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, another cooperation forum that increasingly includes Middle Eastern states, also has been meeting every year. Most recently, Iran joined as a member in 2022. Turkey is applying, and then a number of the Gulf states are dialogue partners, right? Saudi, Egypt, and Qatar, and then Bahrain, Kuwait, and UAE are pursuing this type of partnership. So at this point, every country in the Middle East except for Israel is part of a cooperation forum construct in some way. Regarding special envoys and as far as how China sees itself contributing to peace and security, they have, actually, I need to take a quick moment real quick. I should have said this at the very beginning, a disclaimer that the views I expressed today are my own and they do not represent the US government, the National War College, or Department of Defense more broadly. So the special envoys, where China has tried to contribute to peace and security, and obviously we're talking quite a bit today about Iran and Saudi, but I think we need to look at this again in comparative perspective, that ever since 2002, China has had a special envoy that's been attempting to contribute to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the broader Israeli conflict, right? Since 2007, they've had a special envoy for Africa that I know we're not talking specifically about Africa, but especially as things develop in Sudan, right now, I think it's important to keep in mind that ever since 2007, they had an envoy that was attempting to deal with issues in Darfur and then, shifted to issues with South Sudan in the early 2010s. They've had a special envoy attempting to contribute to resolution of the Syrian civil war since 2016. And just last year, they established a special envoy for the Horn of Africa. So I see very much the efforts to mediate the Saudi-Iran dispute, part of this much broader effort that China's had for decades wanting to contribute to issues that they see as hotspots and threats to peace and security in the region. The other thing that I would just mention quickly is, obviously they've got a special economic zone with Oman. They're pursuing free trade agreements with the Gulf Cooperation Council, with Israel, with Palestine, and they have strategic partnerships with every country in the Middle East at this point, except for Israel. So Iran, Saudi, right? So that's at a high level. First thing, not new. Second thing, increasingly institutionalized. And then as kind of building on what David and Chuchu had said, I think two other important dynamics that are increasingly important in thinking about this. One is just the broader characteristics of Sino-American relations and the deterioration of those relations since 2017. And that increasingly China's behavior globally is seen as threatening in the political and economic realm and security realm, right? So we can talk about that more in Q&A, but I do think, as David brought up earlier, that is, I think, impacting some of the behavior towards the Middle East. Also, on the flip side of that, in response to David and Chuchu's comments, I think it's important not to lose sight of overlapping interests between the US and China in the Middle East. So whether that be preventing interstate war, ensuring that terrorism, is not an issue, oil security, et cetera. I think there are a lot of overlapping interests. And finally, I know we're short on time, but you guys have mentioned a number of times the 2019 turning point with Saudi. I would ask David, something that I've heard more and more in my interviews is kind of a turning point in relation to the Emirates last year in 2022 with the Houthi attack on Abu Dhabi. So I wonder if Saudi had a turning point in 2019, and then the Emirates is having a more recent turning point. But I concur with your assessment that there is this inflection point. So back, Ahmed, to your question on US perceptions, I'll defer to official statements that have come out. Regarding the official statements that have come out are that anything that promotes stability in the region is a positive activity, but also the US government has been de-emphasizing the role of China in relation to the negotiations. So it appears at this point they're being very cautious in the way in which they frame the reaction, but it's been a very muted reaction.
It is very interesting to raise the point of overlapping interests between China and the US. And I think the Middle East and the Gulf, generally one of the few areas they overlap in terms of interests, especially freedom of navigation, oil, and terrorism. So thank you for that. But I would also like to, if the US, they are de-emphasizing the influence of China, rising influence of China in the Gulf, which gives me the impression that they're a bit nervous about it, regardless of the overlapping interests. And something very important just came up the last couple of days. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his counterparts from Saudi Arabia, UAE, and India. And this comes after the US, Israel, the UAE, and India signed the I2U2 framework. So it seems to me that the US is trying to pull in its major strategic partners, massive ones, just like India, into the Gulf to play an enhanced role. Why is that, you think?
Right. And so, as I said earlier, there's the comment regarding what US official policy is, and now I'm going to shift a bit to my analysis of that, right, at a certain level. And so I think if you think all the way back to last summer when President Biden was getting ready to go to Saudi Arabia, and you think about the editorial that was published, China was mentioned in that, right? Not as the primary driver of Biden going to Saudi, but as part of that. And I think that definitely is a reflection of increasing zero-sum terms, that I think David used this word earlier, right? And so there is this global issue. I do think that China's presence across the board globally is being examined in a very careful and cautious way. And that especially if you think about, within the US, across political parties, throughout society, there's been a real shift and a souring of perceptions of China. So I think we have this tendency right now to have concern or alarm over China's activities globally, right? But as you said, this is one area where I think there are shared interests and that there's a relatively muted response. But I do think that part of the muted response is that increasingly countries in the Gulf, and I'd love to hear David's views on this, but I think increasingly, not just countries in the Gulf, but in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, throughout the global South, are increasingly have this perception that they're being asked to choose sides. And that I think that the US is being very careful in how they frame their reaction to China's activities, because if it is something that does generate stability, that it actually could be a positive. So I think both are true, right? I think that there is increasing alarm regarding China's influence and China's behavior globally, but I also think the current administration is trying to be very cautious in the degree to which it overreacts, with a worry that having China vilified in every region could be counterproductive, right? So.
Okay, thank you so much for this concise answer, because we are indeed tight on time. Back to you, David, and I'll be very quick in asking this, because the paper was very interesting, raised a very interesting point when it said that the Gulf states have been courting other Western powers in their search for security. And now here we're talking about mainly Western powers, such as the UK, which is well established in the Gulf, of course. They know the Gulf very well. France, we're talking about France rising as the biggest security partner to not only the Gulf, but many Middle Eastern countries, and also during the blockade on Qatar, Turkey, establishing a very important and significant military base in Qatar. But on the other hand, we see an enhanced security cooperation between the Gulf on one hand and Russia and China on the other hand, and it is increasing and it is worrying, as you just three of you outlined. Do you see the Western powers' quasi-monopoly of security in the Gulf changing at a time when the GCC states seem very much receptive to the new trend of multipolarity and democratization of the international, as the paper, I'm using the term from the paper, that China is currently pushing forward?
Yeah, so the way I simply sort of sum this up is, yes, it's the move from kind of a reliance and a dependence on the US, first among equals, to more of a mosaic approach to security, whereby the US will definitely underpin the security architectures in the Gulf for a long time yet. Dispositif stuff, as I've mentioned, there's no other alternative out there. US military preponderance is just epic compared to anyone else. But within that, the UK will continue to play a surprisingly important role in counter-mine activities, where we are a surprising power in the region. Our French friends, Turkish friends, exactly as you say, South Korea, and so on. It's more of a pick and mix for the rest. Russia doesn't have much of a role. You know, Russia's been proven to be a paper tiger when it comes to military efforts at the moment. Why on earth would you engage with them on any kind of a hard security issue at the moment? When it comes to China, perhaps I'll defer to Chuchu a bit. I mean, there has long been Chinese engagement. There is a whole segment of the Saudi military forces which come from China, missile forces. China definitely plays small niche roles. You can't get armed drones from America. You can get the Wing Loon from China and so on. So this is just part of the mosaic. Again, I'll defer to Chuchu, but I don't really see China entering as some new military power. Do you want to pick up on a couple of other questions, or do you want to go around the people?
I'll go back to Chuchu and come back to you. So it is very interesting that you said you don't see China playing a major security role in the future in the Gulf, and I think this is one for Chuchu to answer as you said. But also, I would add, Chuchu, or go back to the very interesting point of going back to the engagement without interference that you mentioned in your first interference. And it was very, very important that you talked about the bargaining table. China is searching for a place at the bargaining table. But my question to you is, how long will China continue to be able to stay on the fence now between the regional rivals, and without paying or footing the bill for it being at the bargaining table? Just
Yeah,
for free.
thank you. Thank you. So that is a very interesting question, and actually, it's also a very it's also very hard to answer this question. But I think that in general, the China strategy is that okay. So the most important concept is developing. I think are two. The first one is called constructive intervention. So today, while it still talks a lot about non-interference, but at the same time it says constructive intervention means that it does not, refuse everything related to intervention, but the point is to bring peace, bring stability, bring peace talk to the region. So instead of causing disputes, escalating problems, why don't we, mediating things like what has happened between Iran and Saudi Arabia? So in China, it is called a successful story. And the second thing it talks a lot about is peace through development. So it means that, so why don't we just talk about development, since everybody needs it, since the people, they want jobs, they want good lives. So why don't we talk about that? And then we just put aside our differences and we work together. So this is the general idea, general strategy. But as you mentioned, when you practice it, especially when you try to implement this kind of strategy in a very, in a region with a lot of conflicts, although now there is a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but doesn't mean that, okay, that there is no conflict anymore. In fact, they just store diplomatic ties, but it's just the starting point, and there are still a lot of problems, and there are still the proxy wars going on in a lot of regions in the Middle East. So China now, it faces some kinds of challenges. For instance, in the reconciliation, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, we should not forget about Israel, right? Israel is not happy with that, but we used to have a very good relations between both Arab countries and Israel. So the problem now is how you are going to deal with Israel. While of course there are going to be, more efforts to be done to, enhance the relationship with Israel, but there is a problem. And also, in particular today, there is the big context of the tension between China and the United States. So if there is a distance between China and Israel, it can cause problems for us. And I am so glad that you have brought up the issue of India just now with Dawn. I think that is also important, but I think India's role, actually, it has two sides. So on the one hand, so today the United States is trying to co-opt or collaborate with India and bring it also into the bargaining table, and to deal with the Middle Eastern countries, and we can see today that India is approaching Israel, and in a very successful way, and that is also it's also very threatening for China in some way. But on the other hand, it can also bring benefits to China. And why is that? Because India is also an emerging power, just like China. And as David has just mentioned, the implicit mindset is more important than the visible things. So like India, it doesn't claim non-interference a lot, but it practices it in some ways. So for instance, during the Khashoggi event, India doesn't talk a lot about the freedom things, and it still maintains a good relation with Saudi. So in these kind of aspects, the mindset is kind of similar.
Thank you, and it is very interesting to say that India's rising in the Gulf can actually bring benefits to China, although it is a rising power, but it is quite hostile. Bearing in mind now, I'm thinking about the borders issue with China and competition in the Indian Ocean. Thank you for that, but I cannot ignore the question of the BRI. And a lot of people in the Gulf now, not on the Gulf, all over the world, are saying or claiming that the BRI is losing steam. Whether we agree with that or not, that's another matter. But it seems to me that the BRI nature and the kind of projects it focuses on in the Gulf are quite different. They are compatible with the environment. the business environment in the Gulf, the fact that the Gulf countries are wealthy, they are completely different than, say, BRI projects in Africa and Egypt and other poorer countries. What do you think the BRI where do you think the BRI is heading in the Gulf, and how will it look like? Or the BRI, the cooperation between China and the Gulf would look like in the framework of the BRI?
Oh, thank you so much for this question as well. So regarding the Belt and Road Initiative, we know that it has already been implemented for like 10 years. So a lot of things has been changed. So when it was initially proposed, it was like a grand idea without a lot of real substances in it. So everything we can, label it as the Belt and Road Initiative. And sometimes we say, well, it's a grand framework, but like you can put everything into it. But at the very beginning, I think there was a trend of saying kind of like promoting the big projects, big ideas, and everywhere there's a Belt and Road Initiative. But after several years of implementing it into real practice, now people are become more calm. And now I think China, and both China and also its partners along the Belt and Road is thinking a little bit differently. So today, the Belt and Road is probably like turning into a more specific grand initiative. So first of all, it is, as you mentioned, the Gulf is important because it is a rich region. Well, I think that is true because, the Belt and Road Initiative, although people are talking a lot about how China can benefit from it, but we have also to bear in mind that China can also, lose a lot of things. For instance, if you invest in the highly risky places, then it means that your investment can mean nothing, right? You can't gain anything from that. So China is also very, wary or very cautious in its investment at the moment. So currently it hopes to make like more profits. It's more like market oriented at the moment. So that is the first, change. And the second thing is that, so in the past, we talked a lot about big projects and that, probably can earn points in the political sense. But nowadays, since it has already been implemented for so many years, so the more important thing is we need to really achieve something visible and everybody can see, okay, the Belt and Road, it really brings something to both China and the other countries taking part. So now like small and medium, but high quality, low risk projects are welcome. So it not necessarily to be like big projects that takes about 10 years to achieve, but small projects are on the table. And the third important thing is that high-tech sectors are like are becoming increasingly important because in the past, the Belt and Road Initiative was focusing on infrastructure. But today, while it's both infrastructure and what we call new infrastructure, it means high-tech infrastructure like big data, like artificial intelligence, and all those kind of things. Actually, the Gulf is the second largest market for our new infrastructure products. So that is why the Gulf is becoming increasingly important for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm going back to Dawn and looking ahead now from your perspective. Do you think the relationship between US and China and the Gulf, will they accommodate each other in the Gulf in the future, or are they in for a long confrontation?
I think it's so obviously it's hard to look into the future about these issues. At this point, so I think a lot of this gets into, earlier you guys were discussing about, the degree to which China's going to start deviating from non-intervention and non-interference. And I think if you look at behavior to date, they have actually done a very sophisticated job of maintaining balanced relations. Although I agree with Chuchu that some of the more recent developments could put a strain on relations with Israel, et cetera, right? But at least to this point, China has managed to continue to be perceived as a relatively balanced actor in the region, right? That's focused on non-intervention. But I think part of that also is that states in the region don't see that China is going to provide the security guarantees that the US does. So I agree with the analysis earlier in the panel that these are not alliances, these are not defense treaties, right? And that there's disappointment over the recent perceived lack of response on some of these issues. I think all of that is true. But I also, my perception is that a number of countries in the region also are not unrealistic regarding the role that China would play going forward. So I don't see, even if you have a reduced US presence in the region, I don't necessarily see that China is going to play a much more robust security, right, presence. So if that continues to be the case, I think this is an area where the US and China can coexist, and that China becomes in many ways the predominant economic and in some ways political partner without it being fundamentally threatening to US interests, right? So I think the Gulf is one region, but I think there's a lot of moving pieces, right? There's a reflection within the US regarding what is the role of the US in the Middle East going forward. To what degree is the US going to be energy independent? What does the dynamic of Sino-American relations look like more broadly, right? Because the defining feature right now is competition, but I think from an execution standpoint, what competition looks like and how China is approached, I think that is still a work in progress. And so I don't think there necessarily needs to be conflict between the two. And as I said earlier, I think there's a lot of shared interests. So I think it is way too early to tell. And I do think the dynamic in the Gulf is very different from in Asia or from Pacific Asia, right? You don't have territorial claims, you don't have, right? So that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, I think that's a very optimistic statement to raise, because, you know, if this is the consensus in DC, in Beijing and the Gulf, that China will be the major economic power in the Gulf and the US will remain the security guarantor, that is very good arrangement for all of them. This is, I think, exactly what the Gulf would like, and I defer to David to expand on this if he wants. Now, you wanted to raise some couple of points before, but also after this, could you please briefly tell me where does the UK fit in all this dynamic, all these dynamics between the US and China and the Gulf?
Sure. So just picking up on a couple of issues earlier. So in terms of Abu Dhabi and a turning point kind of there, the difference I would say is that our Emirati friends have been preparing in many ways to be disappointed for 20 or 30 years. Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed has always taken a very security oriented approach to things. He created the presidential guard. He put an Australian in charge of it, believe it or not, because he fundamentally didn't trust, I think, outside powers and felt that he needed a meaningful internal security apparatus, or whatever the phrase might be. So our Emirati friends have that kind of an option. Although, yes, disappointed by the friends in the US, without a doubt. As this idea of multipolarity and choosing sides, I mean, it's no doubt that the Gulf increasingly looks to the Chinese model of kind of very strong, traditionally economic growth, technological sophistication, and of course, no democracy. And they are quite pleased by that. This is a nice change from what it was in the 1990s, where it was assumed that to have progress, you needed to be quasi-democratic or democratic or on the road towards democracy. That seemed to be the only game in town for quite a long time, whereas now there's this other model, which I think is very attractive. Another key thrust at the moment is a friend and colleague of ours, Abdul Khalik Abdullah, calls it the Gulf moment, which is symbolizing this era where the Gulf monarchies are headstrong.
It's the book. It's called The Gulf Moment.
Yeah, indeed. It's his argument he's been making for a very long time. It's been a rather long Gulf moment, perhaps. But still, this is his point about how the Gulf monarchies are influence makers and not influence takers at all anymore. He thinks of, well, not Abdul Khalik Abdullah, I'm not pinning it on him, but more broadly, I see our Emirati friends, for example, as thinking they have the secret sauce for governance in the Arab world. They think they have created this extremely successful state, which they have. money helps, but money didn't help Venezuela, Iraq, or Iran. So it's not just simply money. There isn't a different element there. But the point is that with, Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus no longer being the 3 leading capitals in the Middle East, like they have been for a very, very, very long time, now the influence in the wider Gulf region is in Riyadh, Doha, Abu Dhabi, Dubai. And so they are waking up to this new era where they won't be pawns, going back to your kind of point earlier, they won't be pushed around by anyone, and feel they want to sort of cast their own furrow, if I'm mixing a couple of metaphors there. They want to plow their own path or something along those lines. Where does the UK fit? Does the UK fit? Is maybe
it's a good answer.
a slightly better question. We are small. We think we are not small, which is problematic. We think we have a huge history in the region, which we do. I'm not sure it's a good history. I'm not sure what this history that we do have, I don't know if that endows us with some miraculous knowledge of the region, which some people think it does. We are a small nation with some first-class niche areas, like I mentioned, maritime, some bits of maritime security, some technology efforts, education. We are world leaders in some small fields. And if we can ever realize that we are a much smaller state than we actually think we are, and if we actually focused on what we were good at, BBC, soft power, instead of trying to cut the budget, which is just beyond insane, then we might have more effect. But as long as we think that we are way more important than we are, we'll snooker ourselves, to use a very British analogy.
So you think it global Britain post-Brexit doesn't mean anything to our Gulf friends?
No, it means very little. It means to our Gulf friends that the shoe is on the other foot. I'm full of strange metaphors and cliches today. It means that our friends in the Gulf understand how eager or desperate, might be another word, Britain is for deals and engagement around the world to justify this global Britain chisel. And therefore they know that they can extract a very good price for it. So that's what I mean by the boot being on the other foot or something like that. It's the tilting of tables, I think, is the point I'm making.
That was very interesting, right? Wasn't it? It added a lot to my little knowledge of China Gulf already. Now I'm opening the floor to you guys. If you want to ask any question, to remind you of the rules, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and say the name of our distinguished speaker that you want to ask the question. Please. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Latika Burke. I'm from the Sydney Morning Herald. I just want to ask 2 kind of questions here. Is there any concern within the Gulf region about trap diplomacy or those broader issues, or that in drifting away from the US, China will have a leverage over them that they don't necessarily want? And secondly, how much is human rights a factor here in China being able to be a more ebullient player in the region? Does it really matter that China goes to these countries and says, we don't really care about your human rights record, because obviously they have huge stains on theirs? And is that really a material factor, or is that just something that the West is happy to kind of pick up and illustrate for its own reasons?
Are you directing a question to David, or
anyone who wants to take that on, really?
David, interested?
Yeah, thank you. I'll take on a part of that, perhaps. On the first question, we need to differentiate the Gulf. We talk about it as 6 Gulf monarchies for very good reasons. A lot unites them and so on. But there are very significant differences. So if I was Oman, who is much less wealthy than the UAE, Qatar, and I've forgotten the other Gulf monarchies, the other ones, the smaller ones as well in particular, I would be a lot more concerned about the quid pro quo that comes with Chinese investment, as their economic diversification, the path away from oil is really tricky. It's beyond difficult. They need investment. They can get it from the IMF, which comes with a whole raft of IMF strings. They can get it from maybe the UAE, which comes from local political strings, or China, which comes with a different series of strings. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. So you need to sort of pick and choose. So maybe for Oman, it's more of a concern. From the other Gulf monarchies, not really. But going back to my dispositif stuff, not speaking about economic strings, but I would probably argue, and Chuchu can please correct me, but I think I think our friends in the Gulf feel they understand the Brits. We do have a lot of engagement. They dislike the Guardian, but they understand it's a part of the landscape. They can't do anything about it. They complain about it, but they understand it. I think there's a lack of empathetic understanding with interlocutors in China. I mean, that's a very silly generalization in many ways, but comparatively new to get into such deep relations. I'm not sure there is that visceral understanding. It's wincing as I'm making these generalizations. And so I think my point is, yeah, I mean, they will definitely engage with China in a myriad ways, but there always a question of what is China ultimately about? I think that's always there. And on the human rights kind of an issue, well, the EU tries to push human rights left, right, and centre, of course, and gets basically nowhere whatsoever. The UK is extremely concerned with global Britain, and trying to push values and human rights at the same time is an incredibly tricky thread to push. And China comes, has its engagement without interference, or whatever the phrase may be. And so that is another reason in many ways why China is an increasingly welcome sort of partner, if you see what I mean, if that answers your question.
Chuchu, do you want to jump in, or?
Yeah, I just have 3 points to add. I totally agree with what David has just mentioned, but just regarding your first question, well, I think that today, you know, the geopolitical landscape is becoming more complex in the region, but the leverage, I don't think, perhaps China has a leverage, but I think the Gulf regions, the Gulf monarchies are the ones that really have the leverage to play between the big powers. In the past, in international relations, we always talk about how the big powers play the game, but today in the Gulf, it is the local regions that are really playing the games, you know, hedging between the big powers. If I have time, I'll come back to this point later. And the second, I think a very important point is that as David has mentioned, so the region is, they know very well how the game of human rights or democratization is playing. So for instance, in the past, we talked a lot about the human rights problem in the region, but like nothing really happened to Saudi Arabia, right? Even if the United States talked a lot about that, criticized on that, but it didn't really interfere the relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And today, you know, powers like China, like India, like the emerging powers, they're dealing with things differently. And this actually brings an option or alternative to the region, and probably it changes some kind of like implicit mindset. And also what China tries to promote is that if we talk a lot about democratization within one country, then why don't we promote democratization of international relations? And in international relations, what does it mean? It means that every country has its own choice. So, you know, this is the kind of, you know, new discourse that is developed in China. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And the paper actually said it very eloquently as well. The China refraining from the democratization of the domestic and pushing for the democratization of the international. Dawn, if you want to say a few words quickly. No?
Yeah, I would just say I agree that this region compared to others, of looking at the Gulf, you don't have as much of the asymmetric relationship. You don't, other than Oman, you wouldn't really have foreign aid, and that even tends to be quite small. So I don't think that that's as big of an issue. On the human rights piece, I do think the kind of shared interest in non-intervention and sovereignty and the very strict interpretation that many states in the Gulf, all the states in the Gulf have regarding sovereignty, that is one appealing part of the way in which China presents itself as a great power. And the way I tend to think about it is China presents itself as a defender of sovereignty, promoter of connectivity, an advocate for developing country causes, as a balanced actor, as a country without a colonial history in the region. So I think all of that together, especially in contrast with the US or Western focus on human rights, I think that makes them potentially a more attractive partner in certain ways.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Sorry to interrupt earlier about the big elephant, Israel.
Sure.
I think in life, we have to look at the facts in front of us. I came back from COP27, and one of the things United Nations announced, they had 54 wars going on today. This is a question to Dawn, really. I think the new order of China is a great thing coming to the table because you look at the facts. Middle East, you've been there for years, and Israel, even Biden said today and in his past videos 30 years ago, we strategically got there because of Israel. Now, India is aligned with Israel because of US, we know that. China and India have issues of land, we know that. We know, and the words I'm hearing today, I'm sorry to the hypocrisy, trade, allies and arms deals. It's all about that. And I think the new order of China being at the table is a good thing for Middle East. And I think it's the right thing because US's history is proven it's not. I mean, every day you see different wars starting, and where's US there? US is always the face of the dollar. This is how it's been. And I think China being here is the right thing. And I think I hear defense from the US. I hear even in your Dawn, I'm hearing a little bit of defense coming from you, but I think we have to work with facts today that US being in the Middle East has caused more trouble than that's why China's here. And I just give an example of Pakistan. And we were seeing the news of what's happening to Imran Khan. My ancestors in Pakistan, I'm trying to do some work in Pakistan. And we have the Silk Road Summit. That region, China, India, Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all those are the emerging market, the Silk Road. And America should be nervous. UK, where are we? UK, I agree with the doctor here that no, UK, step aside. This is an emerging region and it should make US very, very, very serious. The question is, all these statements are made, I think it's absolutely right that China is at the table because that is the new order, because the current order, frankly, doesn't stand for me because history has proven that US has made too many errors. It's the face of the dollar and that needs to stop. And I think China could do that.
And what's the question exactly?
The question is Dawn's response to that.
Okay. Dawn?
And what was your affiliation?
Sorry?
What was your affiliation? I didn't hear at the beginning.
No, I'm just somebody who, affiliation is what do I do?
Yeah.
So I'm somebody who started small projects in Pakistan.
Could you say your name, please?
Farzana Khan.
Right.
So I've started projects. I mean, my initial project started 3 years ago because I'm sick and tired of the West telling us, oh, there's immigration crisis. There's one solution to immigration crisis as well. Get into these countries, stop throwing aid at them, start doing healthy trade. So that's where I started the project.
Yeah, thank you.
But I've had a lot of experience in China and the Middle East, but US, we have to work with the facts. We're seeing it. I'm 51 years old. I see it and I know what's going on in the world, and don't insult the intelligence of the people of the world. US has to understand.
Can we give Dawn the chance to answer the question? Yeah, go ahead, Dawn.
Right. So broadly, so you started out your question regarding the Arab-Israeli and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You've got a lot going on in your question. So first of all, I'm not here to defend US policy, but I am here as a US government official. I have to accurately state US policy and then provide my analysis of it, right? So I just don't want there to be confusion regarding that. And my own scholarship primarily looks at China in the Middle East, China's relationship to the international order. And so I think the way I look at it as a scholar in the Middle East, China provides a phenomenal opportunity from an economic standpoint for the countries in the Middle East. It is their primary trade partner. It is increasingly their top oil customer, right? And as I said earlier in my comments, China for a very long time has expressed an interest in certain regional disputes. I didn't go into the history of this, but back in the Mao era, there was actually a very strong support for the Palestinians. Since '92, there's a much more balanced approach between Israel and the Palestinians. But for decades, China has defined the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as a core of tension in the Middle East and as one of the most important disputes to be resolved. And I think that their desire to resolve that dispute is genuine. And I think the fact that they have balanced relations overall with every country in the region could be very productive in bringing parties together on that very important issue, right? So I do think so economically, they're a major partner. Politically, they are, I think, perceived as a more balanced actor, and I think that could be positive for mediation of certain issues in the region. And up to this point, I do not see China having security interests in the region. I don't think they have territorial aspirations. I do think that they have a major economic and they want influence in the region, just like all great powers do. So this is part, I think we have to think about it in comparative, perspective that way, that I think China's interaction with the Middle East can have a lot of positive benefits for countries in the region.
Thank you, Don. No. They agreed actually that China at the moment doesn't have any security aspirations, and that they are very comfortable in playing a major economic role, as are the Gulf partners and America as well. Thank you so much. We have time for one question. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you for that lovely discussion. I'm Aboudouh. I'm a second-year student at King's College London. So I have a question directed at you. So you mentioned that Middle Eastern countries are now moving towards an influence-making mindset, essentially, I guess, challenging those core periphery relations, or even, I guess, Pax Americana in a sense. But to what extent do you think that this is feasible given the US economic embeddedness and, I guess, the iron grip on security provision, especially in Gulf countries? Can this actually be done, especially when Gulf countries significantly depend on the US economically and security provision wise? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So about the room for maneuver of comparatively smaller states, given the outsized role of, for example, the US or stuff. Well, we have long seen that the Gulf monarchs have been surprisingly nimble and able to manipulate, is the best word, imperial powers, thinking of Britain and the US today, in a variety of ways. So back in the 100 years ago, when the power asymmetry between the British Empire and the local Qatari sheikh were just tremendous, understanding the position that you're in and being a decent negotiator allowed them to extract a surprising amount. And these days, the core periphery stuff, I think we need to nuance that a lot more, thinking about sort of middle powers, the evolution of small power literature and all that kind of boring academic stuff, because it's quite important. It does show the ways that smaller nations can take on niche activities that can be deeply influential. So within the broad tenor of relations, there is a broad dispositif, dare I say, a broad trajectory of the bounds of the possible. I think that the Gulf monarchies have a surprising amount of influence in many ways. And just on the lady's comment before, I mean, China doesn't emanate to me a cute and cuddly vibe often. So I'm not wildly sure why we might assume there might be much gloriously benevolent, as it were, going forward. They, like every state, will ruthlessly, like the UK tries to, like the US does, they will endeavor to ruthlessly follow their own national interest. And if that chimes with local partners, then great. But if it doesn't, then they'll, like every state would if it could, but will run roughshod.
I still have a bit of time. I think someone raised, yes, please. Just one question.
I am Victoria Hudson, postdoctoral fellow in the Department of War Studies here at King's. I was interested in what you were saying, David, about the dispositif and these surface linkages that can strengthen a relationship. I was interested to know whether you think, and this is a question to Chuchu as well, whether you think that China is working on building those kinds of relationships, strengthening what may not be readily apparent, but investing in educational ties, Chinese language learning in the region, like those relationships that you mentioned. Thanks.
Chuchu, do you want to have a quick response there?
Yeah, that is very interesting. And in fact, Yahya and I have discussed about that when he come to China. And for instance, actually, this is a very interesting point. So actually in China, we talk a lot about, you know, the hard power, like infrastructure, its economic power, and even we have talked about the arms deals. So for instance, even though China doesn't have a, you know, large security role in the region, but it sells like unmanned drones to the region. So like it is powerful in this kind of aspects, but when it comes to soft power, indeed it is quite weak. For instance, we have just talked about the UK, but as David has mentioned, UK has its advantage, such as BBC. So for instance, how does the people in the Gulf region or in North Africa, how do they learn about issues happening in China? How do they learn about Muslims, minority in China? They know it from BBC or from like Western media, right? So like Chinese soft power in that case is still very weak. Well, as you have mentioned, yeah, education is important. Yeah, China is kind of like promoting the Chinese language in the region, but it's still hard, although it has already made a lot of progress in Saudi Arabia, in Emirates, but there is still a long way to run. And also people lack the motivation to learn such a hard language, right? So right now, the soft power, I would say that is ongoing, but there is still a long way to go. It's completely uncomparable to the hard power. But I think from the perspective of China, while yes, it is making efforts in this aspect, but on the other hand, when it comes to the soft power, another strategy is to kind of like affecting the implicit mindset at the very beginning, and then like education, like, you know, people to people communication, it comes next. Thank you.
Just very briefly, exactly as Chuchu says, lots of sort of language courses. I think elements of the Saudi military have also graduated from Chinese military training colleges, which is interesting and surprising. But the more interesting and impossible question is, can you create these things, or do they need to sort of emerge organically over time, as it were? I think that it's really difficult to force create these sorts of links, but you can create the links, but whether that engenders the necessary, I don't know, bonhomie or something is a really difficult issue.
I'm afraid we came to the end of this very rich and deep discussion. Thank you so much, David. Thanks, Chuchu, and thanks, Dawn, for joining us from the US and China. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you found this very, very useful, as I did. Thank you so much.